As our next speaker, I'd like to invite Sharon Lo to join us on the virtual stage. She is a product manager focused on ethics and society with the AI team at Microsoft, which is a multidisciplinary group focused on the ethical impact of emerging topics. She'll be talking to us about why building ethical products is our future. Welcome, Sharon.
Hi, everyone. Okay, it's so good to be here at Impact today. Thank you, Craft, for inviting me, and I so wish I was in Budapest to meet you all in person. But I'm Sharon. I'm a PM at Microsoft on our Ethics and Society team, and I'm excited to talk about this new wave of product development with ethics and why building ethical products is such an important growing skill set for PMs as we think about our future. So I want to start off with a bit about me and how I got here. This is me, age 4, pretty sassy. And I grew up in Silicon Valley, California. So being close to Stanford and other center of all these big tech companies, growing up, technology was all around me and how I saw the world. I remember moments like in 2001 when Steve Jobs announced the iPod alongside the rise of companies like Google and Facebook. There was so much excitement about technology and its potential. And I remember the craziest things that it was so normal for me to be at a coffee shop and hear, an entrepreneur pitching their latest startup idea to an investor. But behind the scenes, and this is kind of heavy, in my small hometown of Palo Alto, we also had an epidemic of many suicides, which really affected me in high school. And so growing up with both of these extremes, it's always shaped how I looked at the world, that while I'm fascinated and passionate about the way technology can change our world, I also often look at it with skepticism. I look at what's the cost. I look at what's the problem technology is solving versus the real problems we're dealing with. That there was a delta between how the world viewed Silicon Valley when I was growing up versus the reality of what I saw. Life went on though. I went to college and graduated and started working at Microsoft as a PM in the cloud. I got to be there in 2014 when the company's cloud investment really started to take off. However, despite all this growth, I couldn't avoid looking around me at the world and how it was changing because of technology. I think that we were all seeing how technology was changing entire industries. We started noticing that we were always on our phones. The rise of data collection and the start of brain-machine interfaces and the circulation of misinformation and deep fakes. And this sense of a loss of agency, the blur of technology and AI influencing us versus us influencing it, came really clear in 2016. I think we saw the role of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica using AI systems along with massive amounts of data to influence democratic processes and elections. And it made me realize as a PM at a tech company, the amount of responsibility that we all have, that we are designing things with huge scale and it's impacting entire landscapes, societies, and interactions. As a PM, I didn't know how to think about this kind of accountability. I'm one person, what can I do to kind of shape our future? It was at this time that I heard about a new team forming at Microsoft called Ethics and Society that was being started in our cloud and AI group, where a 15-person team of designers, PMs, and ethicists, where different product teams come to us with product challenges. And we work with them in understanding what's the best ethical path forward. Alongside, what we're really trying to do is create mindset shifts, ultimately, and tools to change how we do product development at Microsoft and hopefully influence the industry. This is just an example of some of the projects my team has worked on, from things like synthetic media and voice technology, from facial recognition at Microsoft to mixed reality to computer vision. How do we think about how these technologies should be deployed in the world and how do we do it very intentionally and carefully? And so today I want to focus on 3 main topics of the things I've learned since being on this team. One is what I think ethics is fundamentally important to the longevity and sustainability of your business, that it's a must-have and not a nice-to-have. 2, tactically giving you some tools of how to address this on your own work. I know ethics often seems really abstract, so what do steps of ethical product development really look like? And third, this might be something that you care about, but maybe not your leadership or the people around you. So how do you get other people to care and prioritize this work? Okay. So part one, why is ethics important to your business? Because I know a lot of you are probably in the spot of, okay, this is great, let's do good in the world, but I have a backlog of features and customer requests that need to be shipped yesterday. So when do I have the time or resources to think about this? And I want to challenge that very much because I think ethics and responsible innovation is fundamentally about product quality. And it's really asking yourself that in addressing this work, how do you de-risk your products or your technologies for your customers so that they consume it with trust and confidence? To do that, we as product builders need to be thinking about what are potential ways people and societies can be harmed by our technology? What are ways that it can be misused? What kind of mitigations need to be in place for us to release these products confidently? And an analogy of why, another way of seeing why ethics is so important to your business is to look at the way security is viewed in our industry today. I strongly believe that ethics is now where security was almost 20 years ago. And even if we look at Microsoft, for example, at Microsoft 20 years ago, security was a nightmare for the company. Back in the early 2000s, Microsoft was a huge target for security attacks because its software exists on so many PCs. It became a place where so many tried to exploit vulnerabilities, which then affected our customers. It also became a huge concern and focus for the government after the 9/11 attacks. Security wasn't a top priority for building software, and Microsoft was underwater. This article in the New York Times that I found back from the early 2000s said the security response center at Microsoft was like a hospital emergency ward because it was constantly in a reactive state, trying to add patches and address security attacks as they came. In 2002, Bill Gates sent a really famous memo to an entire company titled Trustworthy Computing, where he emphasized the importance of security and said trustworthy computing is the highest priority for all the work we are doing. And he went on to say, in the past, we've made our software more compelling for users by adding new features and functionality. But all those great features won't matter unless customers trust our software. So now when we face a choice between adding features and resolving security issues, we need to choose security. The memo was a catalyst of culture change at Microsoft. It started treating security less reactively and more proactively, and starting to embed security into how we built products called SDL, or Security Development Lifecycle. It became something the company actually prioritized, and it was a huge success. And now look at how we treat security today. It's a default and a given when building any kind of product. In a lot of ways, we're exactly at a very similar point with ethics and responsible innovation. We're starting to see where our technology can be misused and when it breaks. Government regulation is also being more and more prevalent as we're realizing these deeper issues. And so similarly, just as security is where technology breaks, responsible innovation is also necessary to evaluate when technology and AI breaks, because it will. Because of its scale and prevalence now, lack of this foresight is breaking things from privacy to human rights, to democracy, to transparency. So when technology breaks, you are in charge of asking, who does it affect and what's the impact? And that leads me to part two. So you may be asking, okay, I understand the why of maybe why this work is important, but how do I start approaching this in my day-to-day? The way I define ethical product development is that it's one of many lenses you use to build a product. That is not the only answer, but that it needs to be part of the discussion. And today we build products prioritizing things like whether it's compliant. Does it meet customer needs and business needs? Is it technically feasible? And the problem is that the ethics and responsible innovation lens isn't at the table today. And so today I'll walk you through 3 lessons of how you can shape your lens towards bringing ethics into your product development. So lesson 1 is the importance as a PM to bring in a wider lens. And what I mean by that, this is a graph by Kenneth Bowles of what product development looks like today. And so if you follow me on the y-axis, you have your actors, and on your x-axis, you have time. And the thing is, often as product managers and product companies, we're mostly in this pink rectangle, which is we're thinking, what is the benefit to our customers, probably from now to probably between a year or maybe a couple years time frame. That's usually the extent of where we're looking at. And I would say the goal of ethical product development is to stretch what this box encompasses, that you're thinking about more alongside that y-axis beyond just your users and the implications over much longer stretches of time. That beyond your customers, who are your indirect users is what I like to call it. The people who don't use your product but are affected by it. For example, I may not use social media, but it definitely affects my life and the way other people around me act. Right? So what about unique populations like children or elderly? How does your product affect them? What about malicious actors? And so asking these questions is really a big part about bringing ethics into your product development. And it's really about reframing it as intentionality. How can you ask yourself consistently about the scope of your product when it's deployed in the real world? Who or what may be affected, and how may they be affected over time? And intentionality is often about uncovering your own blind spots. As PMs, you are the subject matter expert of your product. No one will understand or think about your product as much as you do. So you must do the job of actively recognizing and uncovering what you aren't focusing on. Another way I like to think about this is that we often talk about the future, but to remember that the plurality of futures and outcomes. And what I mean by that is that this is the future cones by Joseph Ross, which is pretty famous, which tries to describe the different trajectories of futures. So the largest cone, you have the general space of what's possible in the future. We also have plausible futures, and most critically, possible and preferable futures, which is ideally what you should be kind of steering society towards through your product decisions. And so it is your job as a PM to not only drive what a preferable future for your product looks like, but also bridge that gap between probable and preferable. Lesson number 2 is that once you understand who it can affect, then you have to understand how it can affect them. So understanding the risk surface areas. Now, continuing our analogy to security, the second lesson is now that you have a wider lens, how do you do threat modeling in security? How do you understand the potential risk and misuses of where your technology can go wrong? And the scope of ethics, how do you understand the impact of your technology on people and society and where it may break? And I want to pause on the word impact, because I feel like in product, we often say impact and only focus on the positive. And I want you to remember that impact as a word is neutral, that silently impact can also mean negative impact. There's this great quote by Paul Virilio that starts with, when you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck. It's really about, moving away from that clean solutionistic view that we have of technology. And as a PM, it's really reframing the question. It's not necessarily asking yourself, how can my product go wrong? But it's really asking, what kind of new problems or new work am I creating with my product? For example, the invention of things like Facebook, it just created problems in terms of people spending a lot of time on their phones. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but remembering that that is a type of impact. And so our team realized really early on that we needed to create a risk map to be able to identify these problems or breaking points. And so we created something called a harms map. And this is a lot on the screen right now, but kind of follow me on that black row on the top. So we landed on 4 higher categories of harms, and they range from risk on the individual, so risk of injury, all the way to risk on the society, so erosion of democratic and societal structures. And within each of these 4 broader categories, we broke down harms even more. So for example, for injury, we also further broke it down into physical injury versus emotional distress or emotional injury. And this is really the view that we bring to all product teams that we work with. So when I showed that earlier tile of facial recognition and mixed reality, we bring this map to the product team and we do a 360 view of really assessing, what are possible ways that, this product can break in the real world along these axes of harms. How do we think about the higher risk areas and the lower risk areas? And how do we then think about mitigations for them? And so mitigation means being intentional about the things that are in your control while being prepared for the things that aren't. And I'll link resources after, but here's where you can find the harms map online, and I'll make sure to put it in the chat as well if you want to refer to it. The last lesson is then thinking about how do you build and prioritize mitigations using responsible innovation, probably the most important part. And the best way we found is to use our ethical principles as lenses to solve and address these issues. These are the 6 ethical principles at Microsoft, from things like, prioritizing fairness, to reliability, to transparency. But all of these principles sound really abstract. So it's like, what does that mean in terms of mitigations? So I think the best way of explaining what this means is to illustrate this through a case study. So I'll walk through a real problem that we dealt with in a case study of data ethics. And I want to take you back to 2 years ago. It was August 2019, and Vice and many news outlets soon after had just reported this headline: Microsoft contractors are listening to select Skype calls and Cortana recordings. Users were shocked and freaked out, and their trust was broken in Microsoft. What they were just now learning was that to improve both the accuracy of recognizing speech and translations, Microsoft was using snippets of conversations, sometimes your personal conversations on Skype, as training data to improve our speech recognition AI models. When these voice clips are collected, people or human reviewers will annotate the recording and verify the words said were accurately understood by the model. And this wasn't just happening in Skype. This was happening in all Microsoft products using speech. So you can think about Windows, Cortana, Xbox. And so from there, we had to ask ourselves, well, when did we tell users what we were doing? So this is a screenshot from Windows, and this was the old experience where it said, Microsoft will use your voice data to help improve our speech services. And as you can probably see that there's kind of a lot of main problems with this screen. One, users couldn't even use the speech feature without giving their data to Microsoft. And so it was kind of a default opted in experience. And number two, that statement of improved speech service points to no indication that people would listen to your audio data. Of course, on the right, there's that privacy statement that we all know we've seen, and we just kind of scroll to the bottom. And so we kind of knew that trust and transparency was really broken in this scenario. And that our user privacy and data collection was broken. And we realized that looking at the consent user journey, we were kind of putting a big ask to users and reducing it to a single moment. Before entering the consent page, people haven't even used the feature. They don't understand what it's for. They don't understand what kind of data they're even giving. And after giving the consent, people immediately lose track of what was being shared. And so given that, we identified the problem, user privacy is at risk, it's broken. How do we then develop mitigation strategies to address this? And so our team worked with the product teams to then ask ourselves, how do we first define goals? And so user research is a big component of ethical product development. So it's really going back to your users, your indirect users that I was talking about earlier. And concepts like consent, transparency, trust are really abstract. So we needed to find tangible goals to guide our design. So we asked a lot of people, what makes consent meaningful to you? When you agree to give a company your data, what does that mean for you? And so we looked at academic data as well as GDPR, and we identified 4 things that are essential, that they have to have awareness, understanding, freedom of choice, and control. And so using these goals, we created different experiences that went through multiple rounds of design and testing and iteration. We also then, the second mitigation strategy was making sure there were privacy mitigations taken to protect user data. And Microsoft was actually taking a lot of steps to protect people's privacy when they gave their speech data. We removed any clips that had personal information. We broke clips into just a few second chunks so that no one would actually have a full context conversation. We would change the pitch of people's voices so no one would be recognized, but none of this was being communicated to users. So that level of understanding allowed us to be much more specific when we talk to users so that they could confidently know how their data was being protected and how it could be used. So for example, instead of saying we protect your privacy, we were able to articulate the actual steps we take. We could say that voice clips are de-identified. We would say that access is limited to Microsoft, people would listen to it, and that was never sold to third parties. Instead of saying things like we use your data to improve speech services, we could actually go much deeper and provide tangible examples about what exact improvements we're aiming to make and how it can benefit the user. That specificity really drove for deeper understanding and trust in our user research. The third mitigation strategy was really about expanding the user journey. And this was really about how do we prioritize these kind of privacy experiences that, usually it's always this one-time transaction. We really wanted to think about how do we think about consent as a relationship? How do we think about, like our using with our customers and their data, that as a relationship, as a journey. So we really wanted to, before users were even asked to, if they wanted to donate their data to Microsoft, giving them enough time to use the feature, see the benefits, see if they would like to improve it and contribute. After they agreed, if they wanted to, we would then provide a receipt, making sure it's really clear to users who has access, how is it stored, how long is it stored for, how can you go back and control and delete it if you want to. And lastly, we make it really easy for people to change their mind. And that really goes back to control, that at any point they can stop the data collection or see the data that they have donated. And the last mitigation strategy we use is that success is when users tell us. And previously, success was determined by opt-in rates, things like how many people ended up contributing to Microsoft. And we decided success has to go back to the user. And so in our user research, and instead of asking, did you opt in, we created a new rubric aligned to our 4 pillars. We actually asked comprehension questions like, what is the purpose of contributing your voice clips after they did the experience? Who has access? How long is it going to be stored for? And we record the number of participants that were able to answer the questions correctly after going through our experience. If less than 75% of people couldn't answer a question, that was deemed a failure. And it really helped us target where in our user experience did we have to have more transparency and build more understanding. And all of our products with speech had to pass this assessment of 75% with at least a large number of participants before they could ship their new experiences. And we're really excited to say that we received really positive feedback from our customers so far. And this new flow has been rolled out in Windows 11, as well as all of our other products at Microsoft using speech. And it was refreshing that we actually had some positive press about it compared to where we were just a little while ago. And so here's an overview of the ethical product development lifecycle that I just walked through in the 3 lessons. That it starts with widening your view, assessing risk and harm, and then building and validating mitigation strategies with your users, with your customers. And even better is like what I mentioned about expanding that y-axis is, validating it with more users beyond your direct customers. So part 3 is probably the greatest challenge and what is most of my day-to-day, which is then once you care, how do you influence the company and the culture to care about ethics? At Microsoft, we know that in our large company, it's not successful if only my team, our 15-person team, thinks about ethics. It has to be everyone's accountability and responsibility. Just like in today, everyone thinks about security. There are experts in it, but it's still part of everyone's day-to-day job. And so the first thing to really think about is it's really important to define what ethics means in your organization in an operational way. This is the hardest part about my job, and I'm learning every day how to influence a company culture. It's like similar to how security changed how we build products. It can't just be something that you talk about. It has to be something that you do. And so a couple of strategies that we've done over the years is both from a tops down and bottoms up perspective. So starting tops down, It means defining the vision while also defining the guardrails. So when you speak about the vision, can you articulate how ethics is part of shaping that vision, how you prioritize it, and also appropriately reward employees for executing on it? At Microsoft, we actually had, an organization actually change our promotion and bonus structure, adding ethics as part of your priorities. And then in parallel, defining your do not cross lines and guardrails is a great start. Can you define promises for your customers and products, such as we will never sell your data to third parties? That is a great statement for you to start defining what ethics means, but in a very policy way, instead of just kind of a, hand-holdy way. From the bottoms up approach, it's also committing to training and education for your employees about ethical issues, and then also figuring out how it becomes part of the development lifecycle process, just like it is for security, for accountability. These are just a few ideas, but only when the company cares as a whole is where the magic really happens and this thinking scales. And with that, we're at a close. We covered a lot today, but I hope your takeaway is that no one is ill-equipped to start thinking about ethics. Any step is a big step, and I hope I've given you some tools to start having conversations in your product teams and leading that culture change. And with that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Let's jump over to a couple of questions. Again, I'd like to remind everyone to take a look at the Q&A tab. Please add your questions for Sharon. Also take a look at the polls tab and make sure that you're giving feedback on how you liked this talk. And again, I'd like to take a moment just to show off the gift which we'll be sending Sharon as thanks for her great talk.
That's awesome. I love it.
Great. So to kick things off, I think, it's obviously really, really great when there's such an organizational mandate from a company like Microsoft, which really helps get the ball rolling on some of these changes. I guess a couple of the product managers here might be kind of relating to the need to focus on some of these items, but not necessarily be working at a company where leadership has this kind of mandate out that this needs to be a priority. What would you say are like one or two things which they could do to really initiate the grassroots changes for it to be truly grassroots and not astroturfing, I guess?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, leadership buy-in is, a huge, kind of a huge challenge and a huge priority. But something that, we've come to do is, one is ask your customers to drive the movement. If you ask a lot of customers, there's also a lot of concern. Like no customer wants to be on the next PR page, and so they're concerned about things like privacy and AI, and they're leaning on, us as tech companies, as, the builders to be taking that responsibility. And so encouraging, I think, leaders to think about that from the perspective of customers. Also thinking about it, similar to liking it to security, I think thinking about government regulation is also very closely looming. So it's something that you can deprioritize now, but it's something that I think you will pay the price for later, I think, as your product grows. So that's something that we do. Another thing that I've learned that really helps people shift their mindset is encouraging leaders to speak about ethics in like front stages to customers. I think when you actually force someone, it's like, hey, like, when you're doing your pitch to your customer, to some of our CVPs, spend 10 minutes talking about ethics. And it's in that moment where they're like, oh crap, like I don't know anything about ethics. Like I don't know anything. So they take the time to learn so that they can then confidently speak about it. And that slowly builds their interest and their stamp. Now that they've committed to, thinking about it and a vision about it in front of their customers, in front of other people, then it's something that they start to more and more prioritize. And so it's a lot of, I think, figuring out how to people change and influence. And sometimes I think that's kind of the larger part of my job. But I really encourage, I think, as PMs, again, I think that, we are in the best position to be able to make this culture change right now. And I think sometimes I worry that we're waiting for fires to happen before we really kind of get into gear, but I'm afraid that it's going to be a little bit too late. So yeah.
Thanks. Next, I wonder if you have any particular advice on how to help balance out some of the short-term business interests, which might sometimes go actually against longer-term ethical concerns. Maybe a couple of war stories on that to help us visualize that, though.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, this is a very tricky spot. It's very hard to do ethics at a for-profit company. At sometimes, like, we're not a nonprofit. We are still very, accountable to our bottom line and revenue. And there has been it's a gray line. We're not always choosing the perfect path, and sometimes at Microsoft, we have taken revenue cuts. We've decided to not ship products, for example, as broadly, and to make this decision. I think one way I've saw to balance this, for example, with our speech recognition technology. So Microsoft had a product called Custom Neural Voice. And this was basically a speech AI technology where, based on a couple minutes of maybe my voice, they could create a Sharon voice font and use my voice font to say anything. And so a lot of huge concerns around identity theft, right? Privacy loss. There's also amazing, I think, applications. It was going to be really a game changer when you think about, people with ASL or degenerative speech diseases. It was really great for chatbots, assistants, that kind of thing. And so Microsoft had asked ourselves, like, hey, we have this great technology, super risky. Should we even release it into the world? And so one way that we try to balance it is that we said, just take it slowly, take it incrementally. We don't have to just release the gates all at once, and take it incrementally and then see. And so we actually created an entire gating process, meaning for you to have access to the technology today, you have to apply, and we have to interview you as a company to understand your use case. How are you using it? How can we monitor your usage to make sure it's being used intentionally and ethically? And so it's giving also us the confidence that over time, if we've done it right, we can kind of broaden that scope. So I would say that, maybe it's something that, like, if someone is, refuting and say, hey, we have to think about our short-term version and, like, make a lot of revenue, it's saying, well, why don't we, do a smaller step first, calculate the risk, and then maybe use that to understand if we should do a larger kind of bet on it. But that is one thing, but it's always a conversation of balancing trust, customer trust, that regulation piece that I talked about. So it's not an easy conversation. It's something that we always have to do a lot of persuading around.
Sure, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think, it's always tough for product managers to think about the future, even just in terms of, like, getting out of the build trap, getting out of, the day-to-day of working with engineers. So it's, many PMs talk about how tough it is just to get out of the zone to put together their roadmap, which is a super core part of the job. I can imagine that many would say, hey, I just don't have time to think about these implications. What would you say to that, and how would you suggest going about that?
Yeah, I think there's two approaches, right? There's, like, the carrot and the stick. I think, ideally it's kind of through the carrot, which is, like, convincing people why it's really important to do this. That, again, as product builders, you are the people who think the most about your technology. You understand your technology, the way it works, better than anyone else. So if you don't think about it, no one else will. No one else will be able to, right? The stick part is driving a little bit by fear. And I've seen that work also within the company of, like, we've seen, things around the company where privacy becomes a huge fire. Like that, speech example that I showed you, it's no surprise that we actually had a huge fiasco where, news outlets are reporting, and then now there's a huge company focus on it of, like, how do we then address it, right? That's a little bit more of the stick and the fear part. And that's more of a reactive part. And so how can you convince people to just get ahead of that curve a little bit and be more proactive? But I would say those are the two main things, is around, a little bit of encouragement, but also sometimes a little bit of fear, because I think we should be wary about what our technology deployed and what it means today. Yeah.
A question from Chilla. Were there any projects that ended up being canceled after the first step of using it with a small group because it was decided that it was too risky to release to a further audience?
There was, I can't talk about it because of NDA. But yes, there has been some really risky technology. I think, for example, like one thing you can also think about is Microsoft recently took a stance around facial recognition and not being used for certain purposes and scenarios. So that's one. So Brad Smith, our legal president, actually made that stance. But yeah, that is something that we've done. And I realize it's a luxury that Microsoft has. Like we have, we can, I think, take the revenue cuts in some places. But again, I think it's really important to think about sustainability and longevity of your company. And something that, Satya, as our CEO, always says is that our industry respects only innovation, not tradition. And thinking about innovation around ethics as a really important thing, just like innovation around security was so important 20 years ago. And so that's kind of one example of that.
Yeah. And I mean, talking about the future, then what would you say are likely going to be some of the biggest trends in ethics over the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really think privacy and data ethics is probably one of our biggest, I think, top of mind. I think we also saw how COVID really changed that with like contact tracing. And I think everyone was much more aware of like, who has access to my personal data, to like my location, who I see, how is that data being used? And so those are things that I think made it at the forefront a lot more aware. And I think as an industry, we have to be pretty aware of how to give privacy back to users. It's really sad because we actually did a huge study around privacy. And I think a lot of people think, people don't care about their privacy anymore. Like we all give our data all the time. And, talking to, a huge amount of users, it's like, it's not that they don't care, it's that they've kind of given up because they've kind of already given too much. And I think that's such a sad, place of where the industry is. And I think that there's a lot of intentionality of how we can change it. It's something that I've really respected that Apple's taken. If you've noticed, like in the past couple of years, Apple has completely rebranded its brand around privacy so that it can kind of regain that trust. And so that is what I think is going to probably be top of mind to come. And obviously, I think development of AI is to be wary of.